CBP is facing an unprecedented humanitarian and border security crisis all along our southwest border. CBP started the day with over 12,000 migrants in our custody. As of this morning, that number was 13,400.
In October 2018, a few hundred desperate migrants left the Honduran city of San Pedro Sula and headed north. As they wound their way through Guatemala and Mexico, their numbers swelled to more than 7,000. Like others before it, the caravan drew ire from American politicians.
Immigration is a really dangerous topic, and we're not going to allow people to come into our country that don't have the well-being of our country in mind.
It also focused public attention on 3 Central American countries: Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, the Northern Triangle, whose fractured societies are at the heart of the Western Hemisphere's growing humanitarian emergency. The Northern Triangle, the origins of America's migrant crisis, next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
In Central America's 3 most populous countries, law and order are breaking down. El Salvador and Honduras have the world's highest murder rates. Guatemala is close behind.
It's difficult to talk about the issues without looking at the living conditions for most people in Central America on a daily basis.
They have a very young population in those countries that is coming to working age each year that doesn't have jobs. You have climate chaos, agricultural failure, which is resulting in farmers leaving their land. Because of that nutritional shortfall, you have widespread stunting. Children in Guatemala, age 9 or 6 inches shorter than the same related children raised in the United States. Throw that in with the corruption at the top, you have that, and you have the role of the drug cartels, then you have the street gangs, and you have the domestic violence, and you have the inadequate number of jobs.
Large numbers of people, anything between 800,000 and 1.3, 1.4 million a year, are fleeing from endemic danger as a result of gang violence, enormous levels of poverty, quite high degrees of persecution when it comes to, for example, lesbian and gay populations.
Fundamentally, the problem is one of geography. The narrow landmass of Central America is a choke point between the coca fields of the Andes and the world's largest market for cocaine, the United States.
It's really short-sighted to just look at it as cocaine. Each of those bales is really the embodiment of violence, corruption, and instability in a region, Central America, that just can't absorb it. So when we see those problems arise on our southwest border, cocaine is the genesis of those problems.
Central America and Honduras, that's right in the middle of Central America. It serves like a bridge. It's a central logistic point for drug trafficking and illegal flows that go on throughout the Americas.
Years ago, the scourge of drugs was coming out of the Andes, and with efforts made to squelch it through various means, both the trafficking and the production. Even 15, 20 years ago, you could see that the new paths were going to go through the Caribbean and Central America.
As order breaks down in the Northern Triangle, the countries of the region are increasingly at the whim of transnational forces, drug cartels from over the border in Mexico, and violent street gangs like MS-13 and the 18th Street Gang, which have their roots in the United States.
In the 1990s, A lot of gang members who had come from the Northern Triangle were deported back, and they established a system of extortion so strong that the president of Guatemala says that every single business in Guatemala pays extortion. This is not extortion like you don't pay me and I will break your arm or put a brick through your window. This is you don't pay me today, I will kill you tomorrow, or I will kill a family member at the end of the week, or we will send a team to gang rape your daughter.
The Salvadorans came to Los Angeles, and then they formed gangs, and now many of them have gone back to El Salvador. They really don't find economic opportunities, and the gangs give them a kind of identity.
People are not safe at home like Honduras and other countries, and they have lost all faith that the situation is going to change.
The violence in the Northern Triangle is born of desperation. Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras are countries with stark economic inequality whose poorest citizens have little hope of advancement.
Many of these societies are controlled by traditional elite groups. They're referred to sometimes as the oligarchs, and they have amassed enormous wealth. They concentrate wealth. They run the main economic activities in these countries, and their commitment is much less to open up these societies and give opportunities to others than it is to just perpetuate and increase their wealth.
The economic situation in Honduras hasn't been a very good one for many reasons. The impact on security issues, stability, and also private businesses have been having a tough time.
As somebody who's been acquainted with Central America for more than 35 years now, I often ask myself, why is it that they have not made more progress?
In 2014, a farmer could earn $2.20 for a pound of raw coffee beans. By 2019, the price had plummeted to a low of 87 cents. Since 2017, even coffee farmers who supply Starbucks and other Western brands have been operating at a loss.
A lot of their economies are heavily reliant on crops like coffee. Coffee prices go up and coffee prices go down, and so they're very vulnerable.
One has to take into account modernization of agriculture, whatever it is happening, is good in many respects, but it also has led to less demand for particularly unqualified, non-skilled labor, and those non-skilled labor have historically moved to the cities. They go to the slums, and they feed criminality and so on.
I have friends that have been in the coffee business for a long time, good people, they're hardworking, and I mean, they also provide jobs for other people that grow coffee in the community, and they were telling me that, I mean, it's been difficult, like all these drug cartels, sometimes they take up all these territories. They want land, they want to control everything in a community. And if these coffee growers don't do what they say or they don't sell them their land, then something might happen.
The countries of the Northern Triangle have some of the lowest tax revenues in the Western Hemisphere, a situation that leaves government programs underfunded and ineffective.
The Northern Triangle has some of the countries in the world with the lowest tax yields. In Guatemala, just about 12% of the GDP is comprised of tax revenue. This largely occurs for two reasons. One, there's a high rate of tax evasion because more than 70% of the people who are in the workforce in the Northern Triangle countries are working in the informal sector, which means that their revenue cannot be taxed by the state. But secondly, elites have consistently come out against tax policies that have had a redistributive effect.
Wealthy people don't want to pay taxes because they don't believe that the government provides good services.
There's a greater demand outside the capacity that Honduran taxpayers have.
When wealthy citizens cannot trust the state, they turn to private security firms. In Honduras, There are now 7 private security guards for every police officer.
Elites have preferred, instead of reinvesting in state institutions like the police and the military, have preferred to contract private security to protect their industries.
For over a century, the United States government has presented itself as the champion of order in the Western Hemisphere.
Well, the United States has intervened in many countries around the world, but most of those interventions have occurred in our own backyard, in the Western Hemisphere. This goes back at least to the turn of the 20th century. There have been parallel trends, if you will. We've both had a sort of a big brother approach. We had the Monroe Doctrine, whose purpose it was to keep European powers from intervening in this hemisphere. Starting with Franklin Roosevelt, you see a pretty marked shift in United States policy towards the hemisphere, which was characterized by the phrase, the good neighbor policy.
In the field of world policy, I would dedicate this nation to the policy of the good neighbor.
In the latter half of the 20th century, Central America became a Cold War battleground. The United States took sides, sometimes openly and sometimes covertly, in the region's civil wars.
The overriding concern and interest of U.S. policy was to win the Cold War and to prevent the Soviet Union, the big rival, to get a foothold in the region. The view was that countering the Soviet Union trumped everything else.
You have to go back to the Cuban Revolution and the fact that the Soviets established sort of a beachhead there.
In 1954, the U.S. government and the CIA intervened on behalf of the Guatemalan military and the landed elite to overthrow the democratically elected government, set off a 36-year civil war that left 200,000 people dead in Guatemala, and also a tradition of interventionism on part of the United States in what the U.S. government considered to be its backyard. In 1959, when the Cuban Revolution happened, the United States government became obsessed with a policy of containment in the region and actively sought to prevent another Cuba.
The Soviets have made their decision to support the communists. Fidel Castro has made his decision to support the communists. Now, we must make our decision.
The legacy of the United States and its involvement in the Cold War, on balance, in my view, is a positive one. I am not a fan of communism, nor is most of the world.
The practical effects of those interventions delivered neither security for the United States nor liberty for the people in those countries. It was truly a loss across the board.
When peace came in the 1990s, Washington became less directly involved in Central America.
Following the Cold War, the United States government took a rhetorical turn and started supporting the fledgling democracies of Central America with significant development assistance plans.
After periods of violent conflict in El Salvador, and particularly in Guatemala, these disputes were settled through negotiations. As far as those civil wars are concerned, they pretty much were over by the beginning of the 1990s.
The United States and Central America said, well, the wars are over. Soviet Union is gone. These countries will be fine. There was the notion that everything else will follow. And the fact is, that wasn't the case.
Back in 2007, President Bush made a trip in which he stopped in Guatemala and he stopped in Merida, Mexico. In both of those stops, he got a firsthand view of A, the gang violence in Guatemala and in the Northern Triangle, and B, the drug trafficking and drug cartel violence in Mexico.
George W. Bush, like a traditional Republican administration, had a focus on more economic issues. They believed in free trade, promoted immigration, not high priority to human rights and to governance and rule of law issues, but certainly economic opportunities and the like.
We negotiated in the Bush administration a free trade agreement with all the Central American countries, the CAFTA agreement. They were an effort to better include those countries in our economic orbit.
The Obama administration championed the Alliance for Prosperity, a plan to promote development in the Northern Triangle and strengthen the region's economies. The alliance continues with a mixed record of success.
It grew out of, I think, President Obama's, at the very first summit of the Americas that he went to, only a few months after he took office. He essentially said, I'm done having these debates about the past. I'm here to talk about what we can do for the future. And what he said, importantly, is we will engage the countries of Latin America as equal partners.
We are committed to working together in partnership with each of these countries to find ways in which we can come up with more aggressive action plans to improve security and development and governance in these countries.
The Alliance for Prosperity was born because of the unaccompanied children's crisis that really got out of hand in the summer of 2013.
It's not about what we can do for the region. It's about what we can do with, what we can do together. We all have an obligation to help the most vulnerable and to keep families together.
There were many conversations between the United States and all of our countries, and conversations going on inside Honduras and also with our neighboring countries that were dealing with the same issues, and they came together and they created this plan.
The question is, was it successful? The short answer is obviously not enough, but in my view, and like many others who worked those issues, we believe that it was the right track, and we should have continued in that vein.
It is the policy of this administration to dismantle, decimate, and eradicate MS-13. They extort, they rape, and they rob. They prey on children. They shouldn't be here.
As a candidate and as president, Donald Trump has used harsh rhetoric to highlight the gang problems flowing from the Northern Triangle. His administration hopes to check the spread of violence.
The Democrats won't support securing the border, which we know we have to do. We have a border for a reason. Every country has borders. So we need agents, we need technologies. In some places we need barriers.
The media won't tell you this, but we're building the wall, and we're building it on an expedited basis. We're taking money from all over because, as you know, the Democrats don't want us to build the wall. They're fighting us at every step.
Well, it's a complete misreading of legislative history. Democrats and Republicans worked together in 2013 to do a bipartisan bill. It had security at the border, it had security at point of employment. It used visas to address job shortages in the United States. It had a path to citizenship for folks who had arrived before a particular date. It was a bipartisan, let's solve these problems. What we now have is a president who wants to use immigration as a political tool to exacerbate differences in America.
President Trump has pressured Mexico to join his crackdown on Central American migrants. Experts are watching to see how Mexico adjusts to its role as a transit country.
There's been a huge change in the makeup of the population that's arriving at the US southern border. In the 1990s, it was 80 to 90% Mexican. Now, it's less than 10% Mexican, and then the numbers are much higher from the so-called Northern Triangle group of countries.
The ironic positioning of Mexico in between the Northern Triangle and the United States has been very, very difficult for Mexico. President Trump has threatened to put tariffs on all Mexican imports to the United States. There was an immediate negotiation that followed. And as a result, those Central Americans who come to the United States seeking asylum, fleeing what they consider to be a well-founded fear of persecution, they are waiting in Mexico.
Mexico is a flourishing society, but it's not yet as rich as the United States. And so if we look at the principle or global responsibility, who can afford best to provide the cost of integration? Mexico can afford to take some, but the U.S. can afford to take more.
The limitations that the Trump administration has placed on temporary protected status for migrants from Honduras and El Salvador may have lasting and unpredictable effects within those countries.
The administration's argument is that they don't qualify under the 51 Convention. That is, they are not individual targets of persecution on grounds of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or social group. Put together generalized violence with the climate stress on many farms, and you have a significant number of people who are not fleeing specific individualized persecution on race, nationality, religion, etc., but are having to flee for their lives.
In our experience, we work at the International Rescue Committee from El Salvador through Mexico into the southern parts of the United States. And the reason people move on is in some cases for economic reasons, and in those cases they don't qualify for asylum status in the United States. But for many of them, the gangs that they are fleeing from operate not just within Guatemala or within Honduras, they operate on the refugee transit routes.
We have asylum laws that we know are creating the wrong incentives. We're creating an incentive for poor little children to be kidnapped or brought across the border just so some adult can get to be released. How could you feel good about yourself? You say, oh, I don't want to do any of that, because that's what's happening. And then not giving the border agents enough help to deal with the humanitarian crisis.
The Trump administration wants a safe third country agreement with Guatemala, which would require refugees to first seek asylum there before continuing on to the United States. Critics say the agreement with Guatemala, the single largest source of asylum seekers at America's southern border, is not realistic.
There is also talk of something called a safe third country agreement being negotiated. This is where those countries would accept to process Central American migrants in their country for asylum before they come to the United States. The difficulty with that is that both Mexico and Guatemala, as countries that could potentially receive refugees, are very dangerous places themselves and would not qualify by most international lawyers' definitions as being a safe refuge for people fleeing on foot from El Salvador or from Honduras.
There's an awful lot of pressure on our border from people coming up from the south. That kind of pressure tends to produce the kind of decisions that you've heard that Mr. Trump has made, saying, well, okay, if these people are so afraid for their lives, they should seek asylum in the first country on which they set foot. Well, they've left Guatemala and they've gone into Mexico. Seek asylum there.
The United States is a beacon of hope around the world. We should not say to them, you have to stop short by going to the first country that will take you. No one said to my grandmother and grandfather, leaving from Ireland, well, you should just go to England. It's closer than the United States, because we should be your last resort. I think the history of America is we welcome people who are fleeing injustice, fleeing from oppression. And if, as part of the bargain, they happen to improve their lives economically as well, that's good for America as well. That should be what the United States stands for.
In the long term, the most important looming question is what, if anything, the United States can do to help stabilize a broken region.
I think the most important response that the United States can have in respect to the Northern Triangle countries is to take a long-term commitment to the economic, political, and social development of those countries. Because in the end, it is the stability in those countries that is the root of the exodus that is currently taking place.
The United States has a responsibility to help stabilize these countries. I think we have to think about strategies, perhaps working with Mexico and other countries, and perhaps with the international financial institutions, to see what can be done to relaunch these economies. They've got the potential. There's agriculture down there. There's rich agriculture. They can do light manufacturing. They can do certain kinds of services. It just is going to require a little more focused attention.
As Guatemalans, Salvadorans, and Hondurans flee their homelands in ever larger numbers for the danger and uncertainty of migrant life, American policymakers are evaluating their country's checkered legacy in Central America. But with violence mounting and the economy in tatters, the dream of peace and prosperity in the Northern Triangle, which for decades has proved so difficult to achieve, now seems more distant than ever.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet in community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants read the 8-topic briefing book, meet to discuss each topic, and complete a ballot, which shares their views with Congress. To start or join a discussion group in your community, visit fpa.org or call 1-800-477-5836. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.